In a small Midwestern town where sunlight struggles through a smoky haze, the old, red brick factory stands tall like a grizzled sentinel. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It's Iron Gates Creek as workers shuffle in, their lunch pails clanking softly. The morning smells of coal dust and machine oil. Daniel Woodson, a white man in his mid-30s, arrives wearing a crisp collared shirt and sensible brown slacks. He pats dust off his sleeves and breathes in a bit of courage before stepping through the worn metal doors. He has worked here for some time, but lately his mind is restless, his heart uneasy. Just inside the loading dock, John Carter, the black janitor, is already sweeping stray bits of paper and discarded cigarette butts into a neat pile. He does this quietly, eyes downcast, moving his broom with steady patience. Other workers, white men with stern faces and darkened brows, linger near the dock. They mutter under their breath, spitting slurs that cling to the air like old cobwebs. They do not hide their contempt. Daniel pauses, noticing how the men glare at John for no reason other than his skin. John hears, endures, and never meets their eyes. Daniel feels a strange stirring in his chest, a kind of ache that he cannot yet name. The day begins with a familiar routine, yet something feels different. Today, Daniel sees the cruelty clearly. Inside, the whir of machines swallows up voices. Conveyor belts carry metal parts and half-formed components across the dusty floor. The scent of hot metal drifts up, stinging the nose. Workers in denim coveralls and grimy boots focus on their tasks, barely speaking. John Carter appears at the far end of the floor, pushing a wheeled cart to gather trash. His shoulders stay low, as if expecting a blow at any moment. Hank and Earl, two men known for their sharpened tongues, stand near a stack of crates. They whisper crude jokes aimed at John and burst into mean laughter. Daniel, adjusting a loose bolt on a machine, catches every word. He sees John's eyes flicker with quiet hurt. Daniel grits his wrench tighter, uncertain if he should intervene, uncertain what good that would do. The machines clank and rumble. Daniel hopes their noise might drown out hatred, but it only masks it. He feels a pang of shame for remaining silent. He is no hero, just a man trapped by the weight of what others expect him to be. Down a dim corridor stands a small room with a chipped wooden door, the janitorial closet. Inside, shelves hold buckets, brushes, and harsh-smelling cleaners. A single naked bulb casts a weak, yellow light. John arranges his supplies with careful hands, each motion deliberate and quiet. Daniel, hunting for a spare rag, steps inside. He clears his throat softly. John straightens, setting aside a bottle of polish. They face each other, both a bit unsure. Daniel forces a smile and says, "Good morning," as if testing the waters. John nods in return, polite but reserved, as if waiting to see if kindness is real or just another trick. From outside, muffled voices carry racist insults. Neither man acknowledges them aloud, but both feel the sting. The silence between Daniel and John is thick with unspoken truths. Daniel fumbles for a reason to linger. The floor cleaner. It's the green bottle, right? John nods, points it out gently. Their exchange is brief and hollow-sounding, yet for Daniel, it is the first time he treats John as something more than invisible. For John, it is a slight break from constant hostility, a careful, quiet reprieve. As the sun climbs higher and heats the factory's tin roof, Foreman Watkins, a burly man with a permanent sneer, calls John to his cramped office. The space smells of stale tobacco and anger. Watkins sits behind a scarred wooden desk, arms folded like a fortress. A tiny spill on the factory floor becomes the foreman's excuse to lash out. He scolds John in a slow, contemptuous drawl. "You need to pay attention, boy. We keep this place clean, understand?" John stands stiff, nodding, saying little. Daniel, passing in the corridor, overhears. He stops short, shoulders tensed. From the doorway, he sees Watkins' mocking gaze, the forced stillness in John's posture. Other workers peer in, smirking. Watkins catches Daniel's eye and gives a thin smile, expecting Daniel to side with him. Daniel just lowers his gaze to the floorboards and walks away, his heart twisting in guilt. He tells himself he's just a cog in the machine, powerless and small. The shame settles around him like a heavy coat he cannot take off. A small, windowless break room with chipped paint and a lone coffee pot offers a brief rest. White workers cluster at one side, trading gossip and half-hearted jokes. John sits at a scarred table in the corner, opening a tin lunchbox. He unwraps a dry sandwich as though it's a ritual he must endure. His shoulders hunch inward, trying to make himself smaller. Earl, leaning on the counter, makes a loud, crude remark. "Don't let the janitor dirty up the place." The other men chuckle. Daniel's jaw tightens. He fidgets with his thermos lid and avoids looking anyone in the eye. The air is stale with prejudice, and Daniel can almost taste his own cowardice as he says nothing. John chews his sandwich slowly, as if the act of eating in silence is all that's left to him. That evening, the sky outside Daniel's small home turns orange and pink, painting the world beyond his window in gentle colors that the factory never shows. He sits at the kitchen table, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the oven. His wife, Sarah, reads the local paper aloud, mentioning unrest in a neighboring town. Something about demands for integration at a school or a diner. Daniel barely listens. His mind circles back to the day's images. The broom in John's hands, the insults, the scornful eyes of the men at work. He feels unsettled, like a man who has suddenly realized he's swimming in a pool of murky water and only now sees the filth floating around him. Sarah notices his silence. "Everything all right?" she asks softly. Daniel offers a half-smile and nods, but she can sense the tension. In his mind, Daniel replays the moments when he could have spoken up and didn't. He stares at his fork, tapping its prongs lightly against the wooden table. In that quiet kitchen, while the bread cools and the day's light fades, Daniel's conscience stirs to life. It will not let him rest easy. The world outside his door is hard and cruel, and he is beginning to realize he cannot simply stand by and watch. A pale dawn light washes over the factory's brick walls as Daniel steps through the gate, shoulders already tense. The morning whistle hasn't sounded yet, and the air is still cool. He sees John Carter struggling beside the loading dock, guiding a heavy cart stacked with cleaning supplies. The wooden wheels squeak as John pushes with steady effort. Suddenly, Hank saunters by, shoving his shoulder into John's path. The cart wobbles, nearly toppling. John catches it in time, his muscles straining. Hank just sneers and tips his cap mockingly. Daniel, a few steps away, reacts on instinct this time. He reaches out to steady the cart, placing a hand on the handle. John looks up, startled. For a brief moment, their eyes meet. Daniel's eyes say, "I see you. I'm sorry." John's posture is still wary. He has learned to trust no man who looks like Daniel. Hank narrows his eyes at Daniel, as if to say, "Watch yourself." The world seems to hold its breath. With a small nod, Daniel relinquishes the cart back to John. In that silent exchange, kindness flickers like a weak flame in a dark and drafty room. Later, Daniel knocks on a heavy oak door and steps into Mr. Aldridge's office. The manager sits behind a broad desk, its surface immaculate except for a single ledger and a neat row of pencils. The smell of pipe tobacco lingers, and the blinds are drawn just enough to keep the light dim. Daniel clears his throat, voice low. "I was thinking, if we got the janitorial staff better mops, sturdier carts, maybe things would run smoother." He tries to sound practical, businesslike, but Aldridge leans back, mouth curling into a thin smile. "That sort of request is unusual, Woodson," he says, voice dripping with suspicion. "Why concern yourself with them?" Daniel can't meet Aldridge's eyes. He only stammers something about efficiency. Aldridge snorts. The message is clear. The janitors aren't worth the investment. The door closes behind Daniel with a soft click, and in the hush of the hallway, he realizes that challenging the system will not be easy. At midday, Daniel leaves the factory to run a quick errand. Outside, the town's main street looks sun-bleached and quiet. A few shops line the road, their signs painted in careful script. Under the shade of a striped awning, a diner displays a whites-only sign by the door. the letters large and defiant. Daniel watches John approach from across the street. The janitor doesn't even look at the diner. Instead, he heads to a small pushcart manned by an old black vendor. John buys a sandwich, nods in gratitude, and steps aside to eat. Daniel lingers, heart heavy. The separation is so entrenched that everyone accepts it as the natural order. Watching John stand outside, barred from the diner's comforts, Daniel finally grasps the cruelty of these everyday rules. It's one thing to notice injustice, another to feel it twisting in your gut, making you want to speak, to act. Back inside the factory, the locker room smells of sweat and old soap. Metallic doors clang as workers come and go. Daniel changes his shirt, wiping the grime from his neck. Two co-workers approach him, men with hardened faces and suspicious glances. "You've been mighty friendly with the janitor," one says, voice echoing slightly in the cramped space. "Watch that," the other adds, his tone half warning, half threat. Daniel grips his locker door, knuckles white. They stare him down, letting silence through the talking. Their meaning is clear: don't cross the line. Don't stand with him. Daniel says nothing, but his heart hammers. He realizes that every kindness towards John is a step onto thinner ice. As the afternoon sun slants through dirty factory windows, Daniel watches John from a distance. He sees John's routine: emptying trash, sweeping floors, disinfecting counters. John's movements are efficient, precise. He does more work in silence and under duress than many do with respect and comfort. Daniel moves closer, careful not to startle him. John senses his presence and turns, guarded. Daniel's voice drops to a near whisper. "I just want you to know that I see what's happening. I'm sorry." John studies him for a moment. He says quietly, "I know you mean well, but be careful." There is empathy, but also caution in John's words. He has learned not to hope too deeply. Daniel's heart tightens. He understands that this is more than a personal struggle. It's a rotting structure, built on hatred. One wrong move could crush them both. That evening, Daniel sits in his living room, the lamp casting a warm circle of light on the worn rug. Sarah sits across from him, worry etched on her face. She notices how distracted he is, how his mind seems far away. Daniel finally breaks the silence. The janitor at work, John. They're treating him like dirt. Sarah's eyes flicker with concern. She touches her wedding band, twisting it nervously. "This town," she begins softly, "it's always been that way. What can we do?" Daniel shrugs helplessly. He's never questioned the town's ways, never before risked his own comfort. He remembers John's steady gaze and the warning glances from his co-workers. Change feels dangerous, yet doing nothing feels like drowning slowly. In the soft glow of the living room lamp, Daniel's mind turns and turns. He feels the weight of responsibility pressing down. He cannot simply return to ignoring what he knows is wrong. Outside, the night sky spreads out, dark and silent, offering no easy answers. But inside Daniel's heart, something has begun. An unrest, a sense that he must find courage or live forever haunted by cowardice. The next morning dawns gray and sullen. Clouds hang low over the factory's soot-stained bricks. Inside, Daniel steps into Mr. Aldridge's office once again. The atmosphere is tense, as if the air itself bristles at Daniel's presence. Aldridge sits behind his desk, fiddling with a silver pen, his lips thin at the sight of Daniel. "Back again," he says, voice clipped. Daniel clears his throat. He tries to sound composed, professional, but earnestness cracks through his words. "I wanted to speak about fairness," Daniel says. "The janitorial staff, they're treated harshly. Maybe we could at least acknowledge their hard work." Aldridge's response is a cold stare. "They do the job they're paid for," he states flatly. The silence after these words is immense. Daniel realizes he's hitting a wall, one thickened by unspoken rules. Aldridge sets the pen down slowly, as if to punctuate his refusal. Daniel leaves, feeling the heavy weight of the factory's stubborn cruelty pressing on his shoulders. Outside, near the loading dock, a sudden commotion draws everyone's attention. A special tool, a valuable wrench needed for assembly, has gone missing. Foreman Watkins and a knot of workers surround John Carter, whose eyes are wide but calm. They bombard him with accusations, their voices a swarm of angry hornets. John insists he knows nothing about the missing wrench. His voice is measured, controlled, but his hands tremble at his sides. Daniel stands just beyond the circle, heart pounding. He can hear the racial slurs blended into the shouts, the false certainty that the black janitor must be to blame. The group edges closer, menacing and eager for a scapegoat. Daniel's lips part, ready to speak, but his courage falters. He calls weakly, "We don't know who took it." The men don't even turn to acknowledge him. John stands alone against a flood of suspicion. It feels as if the factory walls themselves lean in, listening hungrily. Back on the main floor, the machinery hums and rattles, oblivious to the storm of hostility. Daniel hovers near a cluster of men who discuss the missing wrench. Hank and Earl crack cruel jokes, each jibe aimed at John. Daniel clenches his fists, but his voice comes out soft. "Isn't it possible someone else misplaced it?" The men turn their eyes on Daniel, their gazes hard as polished steel. Hank sneers, "You defending him now?" Earl spits on the concrete floor, as if to show his disgust. Daniel swallows hard. The moment is tense, and he knows his words carry a risk. He tries to steady his voice. "We don't know the truth," he says quietly. The men leave him with narrowed eyes and silent judgment. Their warning is clear. Daniel is treading dangerous ground. During a lull in the day's work, Daniel finds John leaning against a wall near the janitorial closet. John's hands are clasped, knuckles pale. He looks up as Daniel approaches, a mixture of weariness and cautious gratitude in his eyes. "I heard you speak up," John says softly. His tone has shifted, no longer wary, but touched by Daniel's gesture, however small and uncertain it was. Daniel feels a lump in his throat. "I'm sorry," he blurts. "I should have done more. I should have said something sooner." John shakes his head. "You did something," he replies. In this dim hallway, the roar of the factory fades, and for a brief minute, the two men share an understanding. They are both trapped by an unjust world, John by constant oppression, Daniel by cowardice and fear. This quiet exchange becomes a fragile bridge between them. After the makeshift interrogation over the missing wrench, Watkins summons Daniel into his office. The foreman's space is cramped and stinks of sweat and stale coffee. He steps close, his breath hot and sour, and jabs a thick finger at Daniel's chest. "Don't get mixed up in things that aren't your business," he growls. "We have a way of doing things here." Daniel's pulse thrums in his ears. He can feel the threat lurking in Watkins' words. He understands. Silence and obedience are the laws of this place. His stomach churns. He is no hero, and yet, he cannot unsee John's plight. He escapes the office without a word, the foreman's voice lingering like a dangerous echo in his mind. That evening, the sky settles into soft blues and purples. Daniel and Sarah sit on their small porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath their chairs. A light breeze stirs the warm summer air. Daniel stares at the fading horizon, his thoughts a tangled knot of anger, shame, and resolve. Sarah senses his turmoil. She reaches for his hand, pressing it gently. They do not speak much. The distant hum of cicadas fills the silence between them. In Daniel's mind, he replays the day's events. John's frightened dignity, the hostility of the men, the unyielding cruelty of the foreman. He is caught between fear and the urgent call of his conscience. As darkness settles, Daniel understands this choice will not get easier. To stand with John means standing against nearly everyone he knows. To remain silent is to live as a man who witnesses injustice and turns away. The porch light flickers, illuminating his troubled expression. With the night wrapped around them, husband and wife sit together in uneasy quiet, aware that change, if it comes, will exact a cost. A heavy hush settles in the factory as dawn light filters through grimy windows. Today feels different, more tense, as though everyone senses trouble brewing. Rumors spread about the missing wrench. Voices are hushed and eyes dart suspiciously. Daniel arrives early, heart pounding. He knows something is about to break open. Suddenly, Watkins and Aldrich step onto the main floor, their footsteps echoing. Workers pause mid-task. Aldrich calls out John's name in a hard, clipped tone. Faces turn toward the janitor, who stands at the far end, near the bins of scrap metal. John hesitates, then approaches slowly. Daniel watches from behind a towering machine, chest tight. The very air crackles with the unfairness of it all, as if the building itself knows a kind soul is about to be wronged. They summon John inside the manager's office, though it feels more like a makeshift courtroom. The room is cramped, the overhead light buzzing. Mr. Aldrich sits behind his desk like a judge. Watkins looms over John's shoulder, and a handful of other men cluster at the edges. There is no real trial, no fair process, just accusations that hang heavy in the stale air. John stands straight, refusing to beg. He says simply, "I didn't take it." His voice is steady, but Daniel can see the fear behind his eyes. Daniel stands near the door, words caught in his throat. He wants to shout that this is all wrong, that they are railroading an innocent man. Instead, he blurts in a shaky voice, "Don't you need proof?" Aldrich's head snaps up. His stare could curdle milk. "Be careful, Woodson," he says, low and dangerous. The men shift uneasily. Daniel's chest burns with shame and anger. He's spoken up, but it's like screaming into a void. During a break in the tense hearing, Daniel finds John alone in the stairwell between two floors of the factory. The concrete steps are cold and rough beneath their boots. The hum of machinery filters through the cracks in the door, distant and hollow. John presses a hand to his forehead, breathing slowly. Daniel approaches quietly. "I'm sorry," he says, voice thick. John's shoulders slump, weariness pouring off him. "They've made up their minds," he whispers. A single bare bulb overhead throws harsh shadows, carving worry lines into their faces. Daniel doesn't know how to fix this. He can only vow, "I'll try to help." John's eyes, dark and weary, acknowledge the risk Daniel takes. They stand there, two men bound by injustice and dread, hidden away in an unused corner of the factory like secrets no one wants to face. Daniel returns home early, his head throbbing. Sunlight slants across the small dining table where Sarah is setting out bread and soup. The clink of porcelain bowls is too loud in the hush of the room. She looks up, alarmed at the tightness in Daniel's jaw. He tells her what happened. How they accused John, how speaking up nearly cost him his standing in the manager's eyes. Sarah's face pales. She grips a chair back to steady herself. "You could lose your job," she says softly, voice trembling at the thought. Daniel lowers himself into a chair, shoulders sagging. "If I keep my job by letting an innocent man be ruined, what does that make me?" he asks, not expecting an answer. They sit together, the scent of warm soup mingling with their fears. For the first time, Sarah sees that Daniel's conscience has begun to outweigh the comfort of silence. That evening, Daniel stalks the factory yard after most workers have gone. The sun dips below the roofline, painting the yard in long, golden shadows. He needs something tangible, proof that John is innocent. He stops a fellow named Charlie, a shy man with kind eyes, and asks if he's seen anything suspicious. Charlie shifts nervously, glancing around as if the walls have ears. He says nothing, only looks away. From behind a stack of pallets, Hank peers at Daniel with narrowed eyes. Daniel senses he is being watched, that every move is monitored. Fear slithers down his spine. He realizes that truth alone won't break this conspiracy of silence. Everyone is too frightened, too deep in the old ways. He clenches his fists, swallowing the bitterness. Without proof, words mean nothing in this cruel place. As dusk settles, Aldrich makes his verdict known. John is suspended pending investigation. No pay, no recourse. A tiny spark of satisfaction glitters in Aldrich's gaze. He has maintained the order of things. Watkins stands behind him, arms folded, triumphant smirk on his face. Daniel stands in the doorway, fists trembling at his sides. He can't hide the outrage on his face. Aldrich steps closer, voice hushed with menace. "Don't push this, Woodson. You'll regret it." His breath smells of stale smoke and authority misused. Daniel spins on his heel and leaves before he says something that will cost him everything. Outside, The corridor feels too narrow. He wants to break something, to tear down these invisible walls of hate and fear. But for now, he can only seethe, heart pounding. He knows John's life just got harder, and so did his own. There's no turning back now, not if he wants to live with himself. The next day dawns tense and overcast. Inside the factory's cramped break room, the coffee pot gurgles softly, and the stale scent of cigarettes clings to the walls. Workers eye Daniel warily as he enters. Hank and Earl are there, leaning against the counter, arms folded across their chests as if to block his path. Daniel notices how quiet it is. No one trades jokes or idle gossip. His heart thuds with anxiety, but he forces himself to speak. About John. He's innocent, he says, voice firm but not loud. Hank narrows his eyes. Earl's lip curls. Across the room, a few men shift uncomfortably, but no one supports Daniel. Instead, a chorus of disapproving glares greets him. A single phrase drips from Earl's mouth, "Negro lover," hissed low and poisonous. The words hang in the air, sharp as broken glass. Daniel's stomach twists. He knows that he has crossed a line. The room seethes with old resentments and well-worn hatred. He does not back down, but he tastes fear in the back of his throat. He leaves the break room, knuckles clenched, more determined than before. Daniel tries once more with Mr. Aldridge, stepping into the office uninvited. Aldridge barely looks up from his ledger. Outside the window, the factory yard stretches gray and lifeless, its fences and signs reinforcing who belongs and who does not. "Sir," Daniel begins, "you're making a mistake. If the truth comes out that John's innocent," he lets the implication hang. Aldridge sets his pencil down slowly, eyes narrowed. "We have our way of doing things," he says with frigid finality. "I suggest you remember that." His tone makes it clear that Daniel's pleas fall on stone-deaf ears. Daniel's shoulders slump slightly as he leaves. Aldridge won't budge. The weight of the factory's old rules presses down like a heavy lid, sealing them in a dark, airless box. As dusk approaches, Daniel does something he's never done before. He ventures into the part of town where black families live, crammed into poorer housing on the far side of the railroad tracks. The buildings here are older, paint peeling, windows cracked. The air smells different, less factory soot, more home-cooked meals drifting through open windows. Daniel climbs the creaky stairs to John's apartment, knocks softly on the peeling door. John's face is etched in weariness as he opens it. He's surprised to see Daniel here, on his doorstep, in his world. They speak quietly in the dim hallway. Daniel admits he's trying to find proof of who really took the wrench. "I can't just let this happen," he says, voice trembling with conviction. John studies him for a long moment. In that silence, an understanding blossoms. They are two men cast into a broken system, one who benefits from it by birth, and one who suffers because of it. Now they stand together, uneasy allies in the shadows of an unforgiving town. Late that night, Daniel returns home exhausted. His wife, Sarah, waits in their small bedroom. The lamp on the nightstand glows softly, illuminating her worried eyes. She perches at the edge of the bed as he recounts his visit to John's home, her face shifting from fear to hesitant pride. "I'm scared for us," she whispers. "The neighbors, your co-workers, everyone's turning against you." Daniel sits beside her, taking her hand in his. "I'm scared too," he admits. "But if I don't help John, who will?" They hold each other as the night stretches on, the distant whistle of a freight train drifting through the darkness. In their quiet embrace, a new resolve forms. Sarah may fear for their future, but she will not urge Daniel to abandon what's right. She knows this fight, once chosen, must be seen through to the end. A few nights later, beneath a moonless sky, Daniel slips behind the factory's storage sheds. He has asked a low-level foreman named Mel, nervous and skittish, to meet him there. The alley smells of rust and damp earth. Every distant footstep makes Mel flinch, whispering so softly that Daniel leans in to catch every word. Mel admits he saw Earl pocketing the wrench days before it went missing. "I can't testify," Mel pleads, eyes darting like a trapped animal. "They'll make my life hell if I say anything." Still, He tells Daniel where Earl likely hid the tool. Then, like a frightened rabbit, Mel scurries off into the dark, leaving Daniel alone, heart pounding with grim hope. He stands under the faint starlight, the truth now closer at hand. He knows Earl is guilty. If he can find the wrench, he can prove John's innocence. But what then? The town won't cheer. It may only hate him more. Yet Daniel straightens his spine. Doing right was never about applause, just about being able to look himself in the mirror. Armed with Mel's tip, Daniel sneaks out once more, this time to the modest newspaper office on the edge of town. The building is small, a single lamp still lit inside. The young reporter who works late is startled by Daniel's sudden appearance. Daniel explains in hushed tones, "They framed John Carter. I can prove it." The reporter's eyes are skeptical but curious. He knows the town's climate, its dangers. Exposing such a story could stir a hornet's nest. Still, he promises to come to the factory's next meeting of higher-ups to witness the confrontation Daniel is planning. Daniel steps outside into a cool breeze. He feels as if he's reached a point of no return. The die is cast. Even if the truth emerges, his standing in the community is all but lost. But as he walks home, he thinks of John, of Sarah's understanding eyes, and of the weight that's lifted slightly from his conscience. He has chosen his path and will walk it, no matter how stony it becomes. A hush seems to fall over the factory's corridors as Daniel enters early the next day. He makes his way to the locker room, the iron smell of metal shavings heavy in his nostrils. The place is dimly lit, the concrete floor cold beneath his feet. When he opens his locker, he finds vile insults scratched into the paint. Racial slurs and the words traitor and lover sprawl across the metal door like poison ivy. Daniel stands still for a moment, heart sinking. He expected backlash, but seeing it carved in steel hardens his resolve. He takes a deep, trembling breath, removes his lunch pail, and closes the door without wiping the hateful scrawl. He will not pretend the ugliness isn't there. It's real, and he will face it head-on. After work, Daniel walks home through the quiet streets of the town. Shopkeepers he's known for years now avert their eyes. One man, who once greeted Daniel with a friendly nod, turns his back and fusses with a window display. A woman hustles her children across the street, whispering harshly to them as if Daniel is a sickness to be avoided. He feels their rejection like a series of small jabs. Yet, somewhere beneath the sting, he senses a subtle change in himself. He is seeing the world as John must see it daily, with suspicion, with doors closed before he ever reaches them. This painful awareness steels his heart. If he is shunned for doing what's right, so be it. Summoned to an owner's meeting, Daniel enters a high-ceilinged room paneled with dark wood. The men who truly run the factory, stiff collars, oiled hair, gold watches, regard him with chilly boredom. He lays out the facts he's uncovered, urging them to realize John's innocence. They listen in silence, exchanging glances that convey their disinterest. When Daniel finishes, the oldest owner clears his throat and murmurs, "Not our concern." Another taps his pen, his expression flat as a stone. They dismiss him with polite contempt, like a pesky fly buzzing at their lunch. Daniel leaves more furious than before. The rock goes higher than he imagined. These men at the top simply do not care. The next day, a notice is pinned to the bulletin board by the foreman's office. John Carter's suspension is official. No pay, no trial, no dignity. Workers glance at the paper with sneers or grim smirks. The injustice is so blatant, it makes Daniel's hands shake. John appears at the edge of the hallway, shoulders squared, head high. He sees the notice, does not speak, does not weep. He simply walks away, leaving Daniel in the corridor, anger pounding in his temples. The silence is deafening. The machine hum behind them, the scrape of boots on concrete, while a good man is cast aside. That evening, the house feels smaller than usual, as if the walls are leaning in. Sarah sits at the table, her hands folded tightly. When Daniel enters, looking worn and drawn, she stands and meets him halfway. He sits beside her on the old couch, its cushions sagging, and tells her about the meeting with the owners. His voice cracks on the edges as he describes how they didn't care. Tears glisten in Sarah's eyes. She knows what his resistance is costing them. Friendships, respect, the easy life they once had. Yet her voice is steady now. "I'm proud of you," she says. They hold each other as the lamplight flickers. The storm gathers outside their walls, but within this moment, there is understanding and love. Daniel visits John's apartment again, this time carrying a small bag of groceries under one arm. He knocks gently, and John's wife answers, surprise and gratitude in her eyes. Inside, the apartment is tidy but sparse. John's young son peeks around a corner, curious and shy. John steps forward, voice subdued. "You didn't have to do that," he says, eyeing the groceries. Daniel sets the sack on the table. "I know," he replies softly, "but I wanted to. I'm sorry about the suspension. I'm doing all I can to fix this." John stands quiet a moment, then places a hand on Daniel's shoulder, just the lightest touch. In that silence, they acknowledge their bond. They are men standing against a wall of hatred and lies. The factory's cruelty has thrown them together. Outside, the day's light fails and the sky darkens. But inside the small apartment, a faint glow of hope persists. They are not alone in this fight. Daylight is just a suggestion beyond dirty windows as Daniel creeps into a little-used storage room deep in the factory's bowels. Dust motes float in stale air. Stacked crates and half-rusted tools lie in shadows. Mel's nervous whispers replay in Daniel's mind. "Check behind the tool shed. Earl might have hidden it there." Daniel lifts an old tarp, careful not to clang metal parts together. His heart thuds. If he finds the missing wrench, he can prove the truth, no matter who scowls at him. With trembling fingers, he shifts planks and boxes. Something glints faintly. He reaches in and grasps a heavy wrench, its handle engraved with the factory's initials. Relief floods him like a cool drink of water on a scorching day. This is it, the key to exposing Earl's lie. Daniel tucks the wrench under his coat and slips away, nerves tingling. After his shift ends, Daniel circles to the back of the factory yard, retracing his steps to be sure no one followed him. The place is quiet except for a distant train whistle. He inspects the spot where he found the wrench, taking mental notes to show where Earl stashed it. The wind ruffles his hair, carrying the scent of oil and damp earth. He pictures Earl planting the tool here, smirking as John took the blame. Daniel's blood boils. But now the tables will turn. He imagines standing before Aldridge and Watkins, wrench in hand, and forcing them to acknowledge John's innocence. A spark of determination gleams in his eyes. He leaves quickly, cautious as a hunted deer, clutching the wrench as though it were a shield. The small newspaper office glows softly under a single lamp as Daniel steps inside. The young reporter he met before straightens in his chair, curious and alert. Daniel places the wrench on the desk. The reporter's eyebrows rise. Evidence. Tangible proof. It's no longer just a rumor of injustice. It's a story that can rattle this sleepy town. Daniel recounts what he knows. Earl's likely guilt, John's unjust suspension, the factory's attempts to bury the truth. The reporter jots notes with quick, neat strokes. He asks careful questions, voice hushed as if conspirators lurk outside. Finally, he nods gravely. "I'll attend the next board meeting at the factory," he says. "If we can show them this, maybe I can write something that matters." Daniel's heart stirs with cautious hope. The pen and the printed word may shine a light into dark corners. At last, someone outside the factory's closed circle is willing to listen. On his way home, Daniel tries to buy bread at the corner store. Routine errand he's done countless times. But now the shopkeeper, a sour-faced man, refuses to meet his gaze. "We're out," he growls, though bread loaves sit plainly on the shelf. Daniel's cheeks flush. He understands this is more punishment for his stance. Silently, he leaves empty-handed. Outside, the sky glows with fading pinks and purples, indifferent to human cruelty. Daniel breathes deeply, pushing down the sting of humiliation. Such petty vengeance means he's shaking the pillars of their comfortable bigotry. He must stand firm, even if he goes hungry, even if he stands alone. The house is hushed as Daniel shares the day's progress with Sarah. He holds the wrench up, its metal surface cool and solid. Sarah's eyes shine. You found it, she murmurs. He nods, explaining the reporter's interest and the upcoming showdown. Fear flickers in her eyes. She knows their future may be torn apart by what he's doing. Still, a fierce pride rises in her voice. Do what you must. I'm with you. They clasp hands, sitting close on the edge of the bed, as if drawing strength from each other. The world outside their window is hostile, but this small sanctuary hums with quiet resolve. Daniel has never felt more certain of his path. A pale moon hangs over the sleeping town. Standing just outside the locked factory gates, Daniel waits in the silent darkness. A distant dog barks, leaves rustle, and far-off machinery hums like a distant heartbeat. John arrives. He'd agreed to meet Daniel after work hours. Daniel shows him the wrench, describing how he will confront management and bring the journalist along. John's eyes widen with disbelief and something like cautious optimism. He places a hand on Daniel's arm and says softly, "Thank you." The words carry a weight of gratitude that makes Daniel's throat tight. They stand there quietly, two figures in the moonlight, the enormous factory looming behind them. The fate of their struggle feels precarious, but together they have forged a plan. Change might come slowly, painfully, but the first stone has been lifted. The morning sky is a cool, quiet blue as Daniel steps into the factory's boardroom, heart knocking against his ribs. The room smells of old wood and stale smoke. Today, the owners and managers have gathered, summoned by Aldridge and Watkins to finalize John's fate and close the wrench incident once and for all. John enters behind Daniel, shoulders set with quiet dignity. The reporter sits in a corner, notebook ready, his gaze sharp. The men in suits and ties shift uncomfortably. An outsider's eyes upon them makes their usual methods feel exposed. Daniel can sense their tension. They do not like sunlight cast into their dark corners. With trembling fingers, Daniel draws the wrench from his coat pocket and holds it out under the boardroom's yellowed light. He explains what he knows. How he found the tool hidden behind the shed. How Mel saw Earl pocketing it. His words flow steady and certain, each sentence building a case that cannot be ignored. The reporter scribbles furiously, each scratch of his pen carving the truth into the record. John stands beside Daniel, silent but proud. He is no longer a solitary, cornered figure. He has an ally now, a witness, a voice. The owners whisper among themselves, frowning, brows knit. Aldridge and Watkins glower, their authority challenged. Aldridge tries to wave it off, stammering about lack of official witnesses, but Daniel remains firm. He lays the wrench on the table. Its cold metal gleams, a tangible proof that their convenient lie has unraveled. Watkins steps forward, red-faced, voice rising in protest. But the owners hush him. They are business-minded men, and the presence of a reporter's pen changes the rules. Public shame, once a distant worry, now hovers close. They exchange uneasy glances. The youngest owner clears his throat, muttering that John's suspension might need revisiting. Daniel's pulse throbs with adrenaline. He senses a small victory looming, not born of kindness or justice on their part, but fear of exposure and bad press. It's not what he dreamed, the triumph of morality, but it may save John's job. Daniel speaks plainly. If you do not clear John's name, the paper will run a story. People will learn the truth. He dares to stare into Aldridge's eyes. John stands steady at his side, refusing to bow his head. The reporter sets down his pen and waits, arms folded, the silence pressing in. The owners blanch. They may not care about fairness or equality, but they care about their reputation and profits. To be known as a factory that framed an innocent black worker might cost them deals, respect, and peace in their carefully guarded world. With great reluctance and stiffness, the board agrees to reinstate John, to mark the incident a misunderstanding. Daniel's stomach churns at their hollow words. John returns to his job, but there is no apology. Still, it is a step. His name is cleared, his pay restored. The reporter jots notes, eyes shining with grim satisfaction. Outside the boardroom, the factory's halls echo with uneasy quiet. Some workers stare, astonished that Daniel actually dared to stand up. Others sneer or mutter insults. Earl slinks away, eyes down. refusing to meet anyone's gaze. He knows he's been exposed, even if he faces no formal punishment today. Daniel gathers his tools from his locker. He realizes he cannot stay here. The locker's door still bears hateful scratches. The men inside this building may never fully change. He stands before the open locker, calm now, and decides to leave the job behind. He'll find work elsewhere, anywhere that won't force him to betray his conscience. John and Daniel step out together into fresh air. The sun is high, warm on their faces. The reporter nods to them both and wanders off to write his story. No crowd cheers. There's no fanfare. The victory is quiet and partial, marred by the knowledge that the factory will not suddenly become a haven of fairness. Yet John's shoulders lift a fraction higher, no longer carrying the weight of false accusations. He thanks Daniel softly, voice warm with genuine gratitude. Daniel shrugs, a small smile ghosting his lips. "I only did what's right," he says quietly. They linger a moment by the old iron gates, two men who dared to push back against a cruel tide. As birds chatter and distant trees and distant trains roll by, they share a wordless understanding. Some might still hate, many won't understand, but truth has shown its light. Seeds of doubt have been planted in hardened minds. Perhaps, over time, those seeds will grow. The sun climbs the sky over Daniel's modest home, painting the porch floorboards in long, golden stripes. He sits there with Sarah, sipping coffee from chipped mugs. The newspaper rests in his lap. Inside its pages, a small article recounts the factory incident, how a black janitor was wrongly accused, how evidence came to light. The article mentions Daniel's role, not by name, but as a worker who spoke truth to power. Sarah reads over his shoulder, her brow soft with pride. They say little, but the silence is peaceful, no longer heavy with doubt. They understand the cost of what he has done. Old friendships lost, easy acceptance in town gone. Yet something cleaner and more honest has taken root. In this morning's stillness, Daniel feels lighter, unburdened by quiet complicity. As Daniel walks through town, some faces remain cold, turning away, offering no greeting. But a few people, neighbors he never really noticed, nod to him with quiet respect. A small pack of children hurries by, curious eyes flicking to him, as if trying to understand what makes this man different. A subtle shift in the air hints that not everyone endorses the old ways anymore. Near a hardware store, a younger man Daniel barely knows tips his cap, murmuring, "Good day." It's a small gesture, but it heartens Daniel. Rumors travel, stories ripple. Maybe a seed of doubt has sprouted in more than one heart. Maybe some will think twice before hurling slurs and false blame. Late afternoon finds Daniel standing at John's doorstep again. He knocks softly, greeted by John's wife, who smiles and invites him in. John meets Daniel in the hallway, rolling up his sleeves after tidying up at home. His gaze is steady, warm. There's no more fear or suspicion between them. Only a quiet bond forged in hardship. John has news. Another factory in a neighboring town, having heard the story, has offered him a position. Better pay, fair conditions. An unexpected door opening just when all seemed lost. He's cautious but hopeful, weighing the future with careful thought. Daniel congratulates him, heart genuinely glad. The world may not change overnight, but good deeds sometimes spark a chain of better opportunities. They step outside together, the late-day sun casting soft light over cracked pavement. John says, "I never thought someone like you." He pauses, choosing his words. "I never thought I'd see you risk so much." Daniel turns the wrench of honesty in his chest. "I never thought I would, either," he admits. "I didn't see what was happening until I really looked." They stand side by side, two men crossing a bridge once hidden by prejudice and silence. John extends his hand, and Daniel shakes it firmly. In this simple gesture, respect flows both ways, untainted by color or class. Daniel stops by the newspaper office before heading home. The reporter greets him with a half-smile, showing him a couple of letters sent to the editor. Some praising Daniel's courage, some condemning him as a troublemaker. "Not everyone wants change," the reporter says, shrugging, "but a few are glad to see the truth come out." Daniel leaves with a mixture of emotions. The world is complicated, messy. A single act of decency doesn't flip it upside down, but it can tilt the scales, even by a fraction. Maybe that's enough. As dusk spreads purple shadows, Daniel walks along a quiet road just beyond the town's edge. He's considering his next steps. Maybe he'll find another job in a less hostile place, or maybe he'll stay to keep challenging the status quo. He isn't certain yet. He stops to watch a flock of birds wheel across the sky, their calls echoing. Life moves on. Trains will run, factories will hum, people will love and hate and learn. Daniel breathes in the cool evening air, feeling, for the first time, fully awake. With John's vindication secure, with a reporter's pen scratching truth into paper, and with Daniel's moral compass set firmly towards justice, there is room now for hope. Not a flashy, triumphant hope, but a steady, determined one. The kind that lights a single candle in a long, dark hallway, showing that while darkness is deep, it's not invincible.